Hello. I feel like, when you stand up to speak in an audience and you sometimes reflect that you're on the other side of the room facing the other way. But of course that analogy doesn't quite work on Zoom because we're all still staring at screens. But I feel this is definitely my first hosting of a webinar experience. And I think it's Phil's first time speaking on a webinar. So bear with us if we have starter nerves and if we're kind of learning how to manage the chat function properly, because we should be paying attention to it. But I was delighted to be asked because the question of employment for people with convictions is something that is both a kind of passion project of mine, but also effectively now what I do in having set up Standout as a small charity currently working in 2 London prisons. And I accepted before I'd had a chance to actually kind of speak to and to meet Phil, but I was then doubly delighted. We met remotely, of course. In fact, we met on a good old-fashioned dog and bone, Phil, didn't we? We haven't even done a Zoom call with each other. We've had lots of phone calls. I'll have to say, phone calls I find really refreshing these days. And I was just really kind of taken with Phil's story because he's someone who I found that I had a shared passion with for second chances. That's a really big theme that runs through everything that Phil feels strongly about. We discovered that we had some shared experiences, both situations in prison from different perspectives, and we shared a commitment, I suppose, and a belief in the importance of offering meaningful opportunities for people in prison to learn, meaningful experiences that would lead to opportunities that head in the direction of employment or training for them when they come out. And that, I guess, underpins what Phil has thrown himself into over the last few months, and it's not a huge amount of time yet, but he's gone into it with a complete passion and a commitment to make a difference. But it drives both of us forward. So I'm delighted to hand over to Phil. I've encouraged him to tell his story, really, and to share with you some of the things that he shared with me over the phone, because we can have a conversation that is focused completely on how important employment is for people coming out of prison, how important it is that there are opportunities. But I've said to him that I feel that this audience that we're speaking to knows that already. So I've encouraged him that you're with that idea, but I think there's lots to learn from Phil and his story and his own personal experience. So I'm going to hand over to Phil, and Phil, take us away and tell us about your journey.
Oh, thank you, Penny. That's a lovely introduction. Very much appreciated. So Penny's right, because originally I'd planned a PowerPoint presentation, trying to sell the concept to the audience of the importance of rehabilitation of people who've had criminal records, the importance of including them rather than excluding them, how important employment is to reducing reoffending and to give people a chance to turn their lives around. And, when we were talking on the phone, Penny and I, Penny came to the conclusion that actually, the audience already believe all that. Let's give them something, give you guys something that you haven't maybe heard before, which is a personal perspective from someone who spent time in prison and who worked with prison leavers before I even came to prison. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to rewind all the way back to 2005. So I was considered to be quite a successful business person in the property industry. And a lady came to work for me, and after a few, she became friends with my wife and me. And after a few months, we started finding out that things were really not quite right in her family. She was really struggling with her young son. And we said, what's wrong? What's happened? And she said, well, Martin, my husband, he's been away in prison now for nearly 3 years, and he's got an indeterminate sentence. I said, when's he coming home? I don't know when he's coming home. He was called a 2-strike lifer. And I think that was the precursor to IPP. So he had no release date. And I said, oh, that must be awful. How can that happen? How can someone have no release date? It's because he'd had 2 fights, one when he was very young and one about 15 years later when he was an older man. And he'd gone out for a night out with his dad, who he hadn't seen for many years. And anyway, the whole thing went wrong for him. So, and for the gentleman he hurt. So, but he'd spent this time in prison, done a lot of courses, Resolve, I think it was called the Calm course at the time. And I said, look, I need to see Martin again, take me to visit him so I can understand this situation and why he can't get out, why there is no release date. Now, it was important, I think, at this point to mention that they're travellers. Okay, they're settled in houses, but they're from the traveller community. So low levels of literacy were quite common in that demographic of people, sadly, and also a lot of prejudice as well. So I started talking to him about his prison experiences and any opportunities for progression and education, and he wasn't getting any of that. And so surely they're helping you, learn to read, learn maths, do these. Well, he said, I did the CALM course, and that was it. So I said, okay. And anyway, cut a long story short, a bit late for that, I think, but I was able to advocate for him at his parole hearing. And I said, look, I'm a company director. I'd like to give Martin a job. And what I'll do is I'll work with probation. I'll keep them well informed, and I'll come to his meetings. I didn't really know how it worked, but they made a leap of faith and said, okay, then, we'll grant parole to Martin on that basis. Or, obviously he'd made an effort to reform himself. But anyway, since 2005, Martin has never reoffended. He's been a success story. He worked for me for about 3 years, and then he went on to set up his own business, doing home improvements, refurbishments, kitchen fitting and bathroom fitting, that sort of thing. No problems. A family re-established, and regularly every year they still send us messages, to Wendy and me saying, because they've moved up north now, saying that, you changed our lives. And I just think, well, actually, I'm not sure if I did. All I did was I gave you an opportunity. He's the one who took the opportunity. And I always say to people, it's not about seeing the opportunity. It's about seizing the opportunity. And Martin seized the opportunity to change his life, and work gave him the platform to do that. So that was my most powerful experience of the prison system. I knew very little about it otherwise. Then about 2010, I employed a couple of young guys on HDC tag, and that was going really great. And then unfortunately, I was overambitious. My property businesses failed in the credit crunch, and I went personally bankrupt. That's where I broke the law. I crossed the lines between entrepreneurialism and law breaking, and I paid the price for that. I was arrested in 2013, and I was sentenced to a total of 8 years to serve 4 years in prison. So I started my sentence in late 2015 and was released late 2019. So I've been home with my family about 8 months now, which is wonderful. And going to prison was something I never, ever imagined for myself. It was complete devastation and despair. The closest thing to an apocalypse I could ever describe. A lot of our closed prisons are a bit like war zones, really struggling, and 23-hour lockup even before the coronavirus. So very little opportunity for progression in some places. And I saw around me, I started, after I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started to accept a bit of personal responsibility, which I think I should say, Penny, at this point, this is where Sycamore Tree came in, because that was a really effective course for this kind of transformation. Instead of me blaming everybody else, blaming the credit crunch and blaming silly laws that regulate people and blaming the judge even, forgive me, please, and I went on this course called Sycamore Tree, and it was really, really transformational. And I sat with 20 guys, and it's a 6-program session spread over 6 weeks. And I saw the change in all these people, and I liked it so much, I went on and mentored on 5 more courses. So I actually did it 6 times. So I feel very, very responsible now. I've learned, that level of remorse and responsibility, and being able to sit with people and help them as they go through their journey from kind of, denial all the way through to accepting their part, even if it's a small part, even if it was a car accident, there's still that element that we can all be responsible for, and understanding what lessons, but more importantly, I think, is trying to take some good out of what happened. So after about 4 weeks, my wife and I started to come to terms with, the impact of me being away, which is, it is devastating, being separated. I've been with my wife for 25 years. We have 5 daughters together, and the impact was horrific, really. But we knew that we had to turn this somehow to a positive. What impact could we make from this? So after sitting down with people who've had not the fortune in their life that I have, of having a stable partner and children and a home and all these blessings that most of us take for granted, and 24% of the people in prison have come through the care system, so they haven't really experienced that bonding, that love. They've experienced abandonment and pretty much a lack of care most of the time. And one lad I met was moved 12 times between the age of 15 and 17. He never had any stability. He didn't even have any food a lot of the time. So I started to realize, actually, stop feeling sorry for yourself, Phil, see what difference you can make. So I set a goal to try and impact 1,000 people. 4-year sentence is a long time. Amazing. I sat with an amazing prison officer, you know, and he said, you've got to find something good. Do an OU degree, you know, do this course, that course. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do that. I got some funding from Prisoners Education Trust to do an information advice and guidance course and various other courses, which were really blessings to me. But also I set this personal goal. See if you can find 1,000 people like Martin, who I believe as a traveller and really struggling, I think he could even still be in prison to this day since 2005, or certainly he would have served longer. So see if I can find 1,000 people like him. And that gave me a passion. That gave me a reason not to spend all day in bed, which when you're banged up 23 hours a day, it does happen. But I didn't give up. So I went out and I worked in segregation unit at Woodhill. I met people, you know, in severe stages of despair, you know, self-harming to an unimaginable level. And I because I feel I'm quite a good listener and I do care, I was able to get to the bottom of some of their challenges and to learn what would it actually take to turn their lives around so that they don't have to come back to prison, so that they don't have to create more victims of crime. Because crime hurts everybody, we all know this. It doesn't just hurt the victim, it hurts that person in prison sitting crying himself to sleep at night. And by the way, the biggest people you've ever met, they do cry themselves to sleep at night as well, when they're looking at their photos of their kids on the wall and you know, their relationships are struggling and this sort of thing. So the center of despair in our world is probably in prisons. And so I was able to reach out and help these people, and I kind of developed my own system of templates and things like that for helping people with relationship challenges. What would we do? Well, we'd start making short phone calls, but with 1 or 2 things written down that would help make that person feel good and support that person. And if it was work related, we'd start building CVs, and if it was to do with progression to DCAT, we'd start making representations about, you know, how you want to change your life around, the good things you've done, what your goals are for the future. And it was quite dramatic, and I don't think the impact was me. I don't think the impact was the work we were doing. I think the biggest thing of all that made the ultimate difference was that these men could sit and say, someone cares, someone gives a shit about me, and I'm sorry to say that, but that is what I could see in their eyes. Why is this guy giving up an hour of association? Or why I found someone in my life who actually cares, who wants to see me succeed. And that was dramatic. And I took that all the way through Woodhill Prison, Lincoln Prison, Stocken, Coldingley. And ultimately, I had a goal that kind of grew in my mind in Stocken to set up a recruit. I wanted to get back into housing because that is a big thing for ex-offenders. But that takes a lot of money. So I thought, what is the next big thing that is life-changing? And that's employment. So let's do employment first and come back to housing in the future, God willing. So I thought, right, the seed is sown here for a recruitment agency for ex-offenders. I spoke to the governor at Stocken, who was very supportive at the time. He said, but you need to take that to open prison. You can't do anything like this from closed. Okay. And I got my DCAT. I was able to be released to open conditions a couple of months later with 23 months to go. So I landed at Spring Hill Prison. Is this still kind of on track, Penny, for the story? Okay. So I landed at Spring Hill Prison. And wow, the shock of going from being locked up in a very small space, the size of a disabled toilet, with a cellmate most of the time, who 9 times out of 10 you haven't always met, and maybe you wouldn't necessarily choose them as your best life partner, perhaps. And you know, you go from that environment to having perhaps half an hour of exercise a day, so hardly seeing the sun, feeling very sad, getting gradually more pale, less nutrition, to going out to a place where you can walk out of your huts, you can see squirrels running around, rabbits, birds flying, trees, leaves, and it was just so overwhelming, but overwhelmingly joyful. It was everything we take for granted now. I live in the countryside, but it's everything we take for granted, but all at once, like you've never had it in your life before. And the sensory feelings were just, it was so wonderful. So the first couple of days I walked around this open prison, Spring Hill, and I collected leaves, and I collected acorns, and I collected feathers, and I made a card for my girls, and I glued all these things together. And I was allowed so many things in open conditions that you're not allowed in closed conditions, you know, like the glue and the sellotape and these things that might be a risk in there. And So I made a beautiful card with all these things that I'd found, that I'd missed out on, and the girls really appreciated that. And I said to them, now visits will be different. And they were. So my wife and children, they'd visited every week, even if it was 2 hours away, through close conditions, through horrendous conditions. And, seeing my 11-year-old daughter upset, sitting on daddy's lap at a visit, shouted at by a big prison officer, get off his lap. This is not healthy for prisoners or children, because we weren't doing anything wrong. She'd just come and visited, quickly sat down. But going from that environment to open conditions where suddenly you can walk around, you can cuddle daddy, you can hold his hand and walk to the kiosk, you can walk around the little forest walk at Spring Hill, and very forward thinking and progressive. And I just thought to myself, wow, most people aren't in prison for violence. And why can't the people in prison have that element of humanity? Why must they be caged so much? Why must everyone be treated the same? And these are the kind of questions I was asking myself, because I broke the law, but that doesn't mean I was an evil person or a dangerous person or a bad person. I should have been punished. But the adage of being sent to prison as punishment rather than for punishment didn't apply. I was being punished in prison. And I don't think that's right for the people in prison. I think they should be there. There are public protection issues and things. But if most people in prison aren't violent, why can't they live in an open prison type of state where rehabilitation is forefront, where this place is described as like a halfway house, where the employment rate at HMP Spring Hill is 73% of people. 73% of people leave that prison with a full-time job. And that is life-changing work that's going on there. And, that is what we want, rather than we compare that with another extreme, HMP Norwich, where 46% of people are released from HMP Norwich homeless. Well, who's going to be offended? The guy who's the 73% who's released with a full-time job, and the majority of the time housing, or 46% of the time they're homeless from closed conditions, falling off a cliff edge, no opportunity to decompress, to deinstitutionalize. I think after 2 years in closed, I was institutionalized, even just after 2 years. And I think of people who've done life sentence tariffs or even 5, 6, 7 years inside, it has a big impact. Your world gets smaller. People develop a wide range of coping mechanisms and mental health issues. The majority of people who've served 5 or 6 or 7 years have things like OCD and little things, but they have to have the things they can control. So they'll line up their ketchup bottles, or they'll have their sheets perfectly folded a certain way. These kind of things are coping mechanisms because they can only control that tiny box, that tiny world they're in. And I think part of our job of rehabilitation and reform is helping them to adapt to the wider world, to reintegrate, so that when they're in society, people don't see them and say, he's been to prison. And I can see that. I sometimes see people that I haven't known, and I know he's been to prison, or he's coming out of prison. And I've done that twice since I've been out. And I shouldn't be able to do that, because those people should be able to be normalized, not kind of changed beyond recognition. And yes, they should leave prison better than when they came in. So that's my bit about prisons. But open prison, I landed in January 2018 in Spring Hill. And straight away I was taken by this enabling environment, and which the accreditation they got that year, I helped a little bit with the paperwork stuff, but it was an enabling environment, and it's an opportunity for people to change their lives around if they seize that opportunity. What struck me was the governor at the time, Dr. Jamie Bennett, because he would take time to write a little note to prisoners, a typed letter. He would arrange it so that prisoners got letters through their door when they achieved something, or he would say a personal thank you, and I've got half a dozen of them. Thank you so much for what you did on that day. It made a big difference. Well done. And that is a massive thing for a prisoner a prison governor to recognise a prisoner for their contribution. So, and he was always approachable. And anyway, after landing about the January, it was about the March time that National Careers Service lost its funding. And in an open prison, it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. Why would a career service in a resettlement with prison be pulled? It was just unbelievable, because it's an essential service. So I approached Jamie, and I said, Jamie, I've got experience of employing ex-offenders. I've been quite a large employer outside. I think, could you give me a chance to open this careers department? I'll do the CVs, disclosure letters, advocate for them into employment. I think we could do a really great job, as good as NCS, and you don't have to pay more than £12 a week, you know. So I said, we'll call it SCS, Spring Hill Careers Service. So Jamie, to his total credit, believed in me and let me go with the project. He took that idea from a prisoner. He didn't see me, he didn't just say, oh, there's a prisoner, we've got to keep him in punishment, keep him in check. That's going to be a stupid idea, whatever it is. He took the app, he applied to the app, and then after about 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, he ran with the project. And I had a little office with a computer and a printer, and I was able to set my own diary, my own appointments, because I still did a bit of maths mentoring as well. And initially I started that part-time. Within about 5 weeks, it was full-time and evenings, because I was just flooded having, you know. So anyway, about 19 months of doing that, I helped 512 people. And, you know, that system of creating high quality CVs, building a disclosure story, which helps someone acknowledge their personal responsibility, to understand the background of what went wrong, why it's not going to go wrong again, how they've changed for the better, so the kind of courses that they've achieved, what they're looking to do in the future. That sort of thing has made a massive difference to employers, bridging the gap between, oh, there's an abnormal applicant, there's an applicant with a criminal record. So it brings that person with a criminal record onto the same level, or in some cases, a little bit more interesting. There's my corporate social responsibility. I want to give this person a chance. And it's really fantastic, because that system, originally it used to take me to sit with a client, another prisoner. It used to take me 2 hours to do a high quality CV, disclosure letter, prepare them with application letters, those kind of things. The system of copy and pasting the templates now takes about an hour and 10 minutes. And they look at this CV, and again, it's this point of someone believing in them. And they say, wow, I never knew I'd achieved all of that. I would want to give myself a job. I'd want to employ myself now. And it is really life-changing, that ability to sit down with someone and say, I believe in you. I think that you can turn your life around, but it's in your hands to do it, but I'm going to support you. That kind of thing. You know, they have to come halfway. But what I found is, and the research backs this up, is that most people will go halfway. 85% of people leaving prison look for a job on release. So that statistic speaks volumes to me, because someone who's committed to a life of crime would not apply to work in a building site, or would not apply to work in a cafe. You know, people who really want to be career criminals on the streets, like a roadman, as they call it, then they're not going to go applying to work in Amazon warehouse. But so why are these 85% of people leaving prison? Why are they applying for jobs? Because they want to work, because they don't want to go back to prison, because they actually want to do something that makes their mum proud, their partner proud, their parents proud, this kind of thing. Someone's just put Ruth has very kindly put a comment, love that Phil was supported to start this project. I completely agree. Dr. Jamie Bennett is a life-changing governor. And that is what the prison service needs. People with that attitude that enter the service saying, like Dave Waddleton, the prison officer I met for the first time, he said to me, I'm here to change lives. That is exactly what the service needs. We do not want people who are there to punish. Security is a big consideration. Safety is essential, but we need people who say, I want to help that person to turn their life around. And Ruth is spot on. I've been in contact with Ralph Lukowski, who was the governor of HMP Stafford. And when I was at Spring Hill, because of the good work that Spring Hill Career Service was doing, I was invited to speak whilst I was still a serving prisoner at a number of other prisons. So I spoke at Brixton, spoke at Stafford and things. And what really stood out for me was going to Stafford Prison. I'll never forget it, because when I walked into that prison, the atmosphere was completely different from any other closed prison I'd ever been to. It was an award ceremony, and I was invited to speak in the afternoon, in the morning and in the afternoon. The prisoners had this attitude of positivity. The staff were respectful to the prisoners. There was this whole positive. You just could walk in and sense, wow, this place is about positivity and progression. And I met Ralph. I shook his hand, said hello, and I said, so could you tell me about your rehabilitative culture here? Because that was the phrase that was being talked around, and it's still so important. He said, we are returning citizens to the community. That's what we're doing. And that is the attitude, I think, because The majority of people, so apart from about, I think there's about 80 life sentence prisoners who are whole of natural life. So apart from that, we've got 80,000 people currently locked away. But those 80,000 people are in prison temporarily. They're going to be released at some point. The key point that I feel, having come through closed conditions and not helped by closed conditions, apart from things like Sycamore Tree and volunteers that I met and people like that, the key point is, do we want those 80,000 people more or less likely to commit crime on release? It's a simple question. More or less likely to create victims of crime? And the ultimate answer is we want fewer victims of crime. So we need, if we're going to do that, we need to help these people, not damage them further. So most of the people in prison have experienced things that many of us couldn't imagine experiencing. A lot of it's of their own fault, but not all of it. Like I say, the care system, the military veterans who experience PTSD. I think about 9 or 10% of our prison population are veterans. About 20%, 22% of applicants to my employment agency, Exceed, are veterans who have served in the armed forces. It's a large demographic of people I work with. So these people are suffering trauma, and I think the psychologists talk about a trauma-informed approach. And when I've seen that in action, it just makes the huge difference. There was a young lad called Lee I met at Spring Hill, and he came from Swaleside, and he'd had so many problems. He was threatened with a knife there, he was hurt, assaulted, and he had a really terrible time at Swaleside prison. He'd been pulled into drug culture at the age of 15, got into prison at 18 or 19, and spent those few years in Swaleside before he came to Spring Hill. He was clearly suffering PTSD, but there was no counselling or anything particularly available for him. But he sat down with me, and we did his CV and disclosure, and he was talking it through. So I gave him more time than anyone else, and he was telling me about all these. And I think just talking through it helped, and that's where I first learned about trauma-based approaches, because I was thinking I've got to come at helping Lee from the position of dealing with his trauma, first. We can't ignore it. It's affected him so much. If he buries it, it's just going to be worse. And he would often pop in, because I'd have the office open after dinner time, for 2 hours, and and sometimes I'd see a client and stuff. But sometimes he'd pop in and just see whether anyone was in there, and he'd sit down and just say, "Oh, have you got a minute?" And he'd just talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and it made a big difference. I think that. So I'm trying to learn more about this trauma-based approach, because I think that is where we need to be coming from. We need to recognise the problem rather than burying the problem and ignoring it. In terms of prison governors, prison staff, prison education teams, they have the real power to change people's lives, and I know so many of them do want to. I'm full of admiration for what they do, and I'm just letting them know from a prisoner's perspective, they really can help people. And if you help, one person a day or a week or a month or even a year, to turn their lives around, then the ripples from that, as we learned from the Sycamore Tree program, the ripples go out further and further and further into society. Those families that have been devastated can start to heal, and everyone can move forward and start having a better life. My story then, Spring Hill Career Service thrived. I was very pleased that they got a funding back for information, advice and guidance about 3 weeks before I left. So it was really beautiful, actually. It came full circle, because Advisor, who another agency, came in to run a careers department. I literally had two weeks left. I gave a copy of my book, which is the full system, to the Advisor lady. I sat down with her and said, right, this is how I've been doing it, the CVs, and save you time, you just copy and paste. And, because people who've done 15 years in prison, they'll say, I haven't got any jobs to put on my CV. What do I do? And I say, don't worry, you can have an amazing CV. And their CV will show kitchen orderly, and it may be 2 years of working in the kitchen, helping to prepare food, knowing about allergies and food hygiene. It might show 2 years as a gym orderly, helping people do remedial gym after injuries or accidents, and having gained level 2 or level 3 qualifications. It might show 3 or 4 years working in workshops, and their CV will be built up with all these skills, knowledge, and experience. And that's when they look at it and say, "Wow, I didn't even realise I'd forgotten all that," and it just looks great. And that's advocating for them into employment. Then is such a pleasure. I remember a life sentence prisoner. He'd served 15 years before he came to Spring Hill, and he just said, you're wasting your time with me. No one's going to employ me. I'll never get a job. You can't do a CV. You know, my work before, I'm too old. I think he was about 57 or something. And we did the CV process, and his eyes started widening. And then 2 weeks later, we had an interview at a car breakers yard, you know, for doing all the admin, listing things on the internet and stuff. And anyway, before you know it, he got the job and he worked in this car breakers yard. And it's life-changing stuff, because that will also then serve to help him get his parole as well, like it did Martin all those years ago. So that was really good. I remember particularly, perhaps before we move on, after leaving Spring Hill, I remember a young lad called James who lived opposite me at Spring Hill, and he had never worked, and his mum had sadly passed away, and his dad his uncle rather was caring for him. That's right, he didn't have his dad. His uncle was caring for him, but he never had any food in the house, so his uncle only used to put food in the fridge when social services would be coming round. So most of the time he didn't have much food, and often he'd be left locked out in the garden, sleep in the garden. It was just a horrible childhood. He had about a year in private school that social services paid for, which was a blessing in his life. It helped him to get an education, and, you know, gave him a lot of motivation. But apart from that, he to feed himself, so he says, he fell into supplying cannabis. So when I met him, he was in his final stages of his prison sentence, not having had a proper job really, apart from you know, little bits and pieces here and there. So what was really great was to see this young lad, James, get up every morning at 10 to 7 with his high visibility yellow vest. He got funded to do his digger and dumper truck license and his CSCS card, which was beautiful. So he's got these qualifications, he's got on this high visibility vest, and every morning I'd hear him, he'd be the one who wakes me up with his door slam. He'd go out and go to work, proud as anything to be going to work. And he was released a month after me. So he was released in December last year. And he reached out to me on Facebook. And it's just brilliant, because the success now, he kept his job after. So he had that job whilst he was still a serving prisoner, and kept that job after. Elsewhere in his life, whoever he meets, whatever goes on, he's got that cornerstone of a successful life. It's saying my internet's gone unstable. I don't know. Hopefully you can still hear me. Great. Okay. So he's got that important thing, and it was the fact that he wanted to do it. He wasn't forced to do it. It wasn't like in some prisons where they say, right, you're going to work in workshop, you're going to work in waste management, you're going to work in the kitchens. No, he was able to choose to work, get the qualifications, and with pride and joy build a life for himself before he was even released. And I think that is the gold standard. You know, that is what we should be aiming for. We should be aiming for people to leave prison with a job, with housing ready. You know, that would be amazing. But at the very least, they should leave prison with resettlement support, like Standout does, and like Exceed are doing, to say, look, I will catch you when you're released. I will support you, and we will help you and advocate for you into employment. Because being released without housing or employment is very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to not fall into bad company or bad habits. Yeah, so I was released in November from Spring Hill. And of course, I was determined to keep this going, this kind of work I wanted to do. So I published my books, How to Get a Great Job When You've Got a Criminal Record, which is now being used in a number of prisons and resettlement departments and probation offices. And another book, which His Honour Judge Samuels kindly wrote the preface for, if I may, which is called If Criminals Can Change, So Should Society and Our Prisons. So this is the book I documented my experiences and findings of the prison system. What good I think is happening, and there is a lot of good, but also how I think it could change for the better. But this is the handbook. It's an A4 book, so that people can actually work through it. And it's full of all the templates for the prison jobs. So it's got 100 prison job templates. It's got 300 normal job templates. So I try and get as many copies free as I can, you know, into prison libraries and to people that need it. But they're available on Amazon as well. But yeah, so the main thing I was really focused on doing on release was launching the recruitment agency for ex-offenders. So carrying on that work and helping them get into employment, advocating for them, building their CV, their disclosure letter, and hand-holding them for the first couple of months. So that's the work I started doing in December after my release. But of course, we hit lockdown, and yeah, that was really challenging. Employers weren't really hiring. But now we're coming out of lockdown. I'm flooded with applicants. I've got people helping me as well to do people's CVs and disclosures and document their stories. And I am seeing a lot of the green shoots of hope of employers saying, you know, we do want to give people a chance. I think there always were them employers, but I think they're in more of a minority. Whereas I think that it's becoming, with campaigns like Ban the Box campaign, New Futures Network, I think we're seeing a growing awareness that, you know, it's very simple. If you want people to not commit crime and to build a meaningful life, then inclusion is the way forward, not exclusion. We can't keep ostracizing people and punishing people over and over and over again. They did wrong. They know they did wrong. Half of them admitted it, but they paid the price. So I think we need to kind of bring back into society that idea of debt paid to society, clean slate a little bit, while still being aware of risk assessments. You know, and that's what people need. And I was very thrilled recently to see the government's bringing in incentives for the employment of veterans. So the first year of employing an armed forces veteran is employers' national insurance free. That's a massive incentive for employers to say, I will give that person a try now. And I think it will happen, but I would like to see a widening of that to include more excluded groups, you know, such as people with criminal records, people with complex histories, you know, as an incentive to employers to say, why would we try that person? Some employers still are risk adverse and they feel that there is a risk, even though, you know, we do explain to people that that offence it might have been a one-off, or it certainly wasn't linked to any employment or work-related things. This was outside of the workplace, and with the right risk assessments and the right placements, there is no greater risk. I don't believe there's a greater risk of someone having committed offence, come out of prison, understood what they went wrong. I do not believe that in most cases that poses any greater risk to an employer than someone who has never been caught. Because, you know, I can pretty much guarantee you every single person over 40 has broken the law at some point, in some way. I'm not saying in the same big way, but at some point, you know, with 11 million people, 17 million people, isn't it? No, it's 17%, 11 million people, that's it. With a criminal record, that's 1 in 6 of us. Everyone has done something at some point. And some of the people who contact me haven't been to prison, but they have a criminal record for the most ridiculous thing. And it makes me question, why would an employer judge that person and tick the box just to say, well, you're excluded because you have a criminal record? I mean, one lady, you know, we were engaging with had a criminal record for not getting her child to school, you know, after fleeing domestic violence, unfortunately, and the school being so far away. So, you know, it's crazy. Another lady won an employment tribunal against her employer, but they refused to pay out, and it was out of timescale, so they didn't get the payment. So in a fit of rage, she drove a car over a school field and damaged the field and got a criminal record for criminal damage. And it's a crazy one-off, and she admits it was wrong, incident in her life. She didn't go to prison. And this person's highly qualified, highly skilled. Why shouldn't she get back into employment again? And so I think we really need to call on employers to be much more open-minded about helping people to resettle and reintegrate into society.
Phil, I feel like I hope our audience has enjoyed that as much as I have, and will realise why I encourage you to kind of tell your story, because you've touched on so many really fascinating and I think really important areas that don't get discussed. I suspect there are going to be some questions coming. There's definitely some interest in your book, Phil, so thank you for flagging that, and we'll share those details.
Thank you.
But this actually was something that has occurred to me as listening to you this time. You talked about people, you know, being able to prepare, and in particular if they have a long sentence and are coming out of open conditions, they've got that period of time to progress through the system, to have an opportunity to have ROTL and to be released daily for work. But of course that there are lots of people within our prisons for whom that's not a possibility, because their sentences are of such a period of time that they'll be released from a CCAT prison potentially, and won't get down into decat and rottle. And I hear in our work lots of use of the phrase, you know, our prisons are full of work-ready people. And I just wondered how, when you look at a CCAT type release situation, you feel we can help people to be ready, because actually I think a lot of the experience we would say at Standout that we have is much as you highlighted around that institutionalization, the need to decompress. And I wonder if there's a risk sometimes that we might push people too quickly into employment when actually, you know, they need to do that piece of work around settling themselves successfully, kind of re-establishing themselves, reminding themselves actually what they're about as people. And I just wonder whether you had any thoughts on that experience. I know obviously you went all the way to DCAT, but quite a lot of people don't get that chance.
Yes. So I think you're talking more about short sentence people rather than long sentence people. So that brings into the question the merits of short sentences, which is a debate, I guess, for another day. And some of the crime diversion schemes, because when you're talking about a short sentence of less than 6 to 12 months, is there any benefit in it? And I think it's really hard to argue the benefit when one young lad I met was working as a manager for Sky, and he went on a journey to Leeds, and him and his friend were sharing the driving time, and whilst he was driving, he sped, and he lied on the document, committed fraud by saying it was his friend, and his friend went along with it. He went to prison for 8 months. Now, that prison sentence, he broke the law without question, but he was previously of good character. The crime that led to the eight-month sentence, the 8 month sentence had a bigger impact, I think, than a normal prison sentence would, because he lost his job, he lost his flat, he lost his girlfriend. Now, so you're talking about the 3 most important things, really: housing, employment, and family ties. The most important 3 things. So when he is released, he's going to have nothing. He's going to hit the ground with nothing. So the merits of the short sentence, in the absence of you know, some sort of judicial monitoring, which I was hoping we perhaps could touch on in a little while. I think that might be a question for later. But is there any benefit to that? Because what we've seen is it is a bombshell. You know, and the prison sentence is a bombshell. Whether it's a bombshell of one's own making or not is not the point for a minute. It's a bombshell. It destroys everything. It destroys a whole life. I mean, my daughter, Joy, she was nearly excluded for school. She has Asperger's. She was nearly excluded from school for bad behaviour because of coping with me being in prison. There was no support for her. I spoke to her on the phone. I said, Joy, this is terrible. What's happening? I was about a year into the sentence by then. I said, Joy, it's like Daddy's got to get through this one day at a time. And they were basically targeting her. They weren't managing her special needs very well. And I said, if I can get through this, you can get through that. We'll do it one day at a time together. We'll do it. So I would phone her and I'd have 10 minutes every day just with Joy, and we'd go through it. Now, Joy came top of her county in her GCSEs. She didn't end up getting excluded. She got 9 or 10, 8 or 9, which is the equivalent of A's and A stars. The cleverest girl in the county at her GCSEs, and she's going to Cambridge University. I don't know if you can still hear me. The screen's gone funny.
Yeah, we can.
Great. Yeah. So thank you. So the impact on the family is immeasurable. I mean,
yes.
Wendy, my wife, developed anorexia, you know, after 25 years together, grieving, losing each other. It was horrendous. And, you know, and I don't see, even a short sentence or a long sentence, I don't see a benefit in a short sentence. All it does, okay, it pulls them out of a criminal network, perhaps. But crime diversion schemes and alternatives to custody must be increased.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. I'm going to, I'll throw one more question to you, and then the questions are coming in, Phil. So I'm going to encourage you to keep short answers, and we can tick off as many as we can. Did you see, and this one actually comes from Helena, but I'll throw it out to you, and then we'll pick the next one. Any examples in your experience of prison education departments working really effectively with employers? For example, well, I think apprenticeships don't yet happen into prisons, and they have to start afterwards. But any examples you saw of good practice of linking with employers?
Yes, there's quite a lot. There's a lot of familiar names working in prisons right now, things like Halfords, Greggs, Timpsons. There's a number of prisons doing the PTS Round Track course, which is a pathway into immediate employment for those people who want to do it and who pass it, personal track safety. So they start out as a labourer on the railways and then build up from there. Like I say, Spring Hill Prison, to me, there's a new governor there, Becky Hayward, but again, very forward thinking. That, to me, is an example. I was very lucky to go there. It's an example of what a forward-thinking resettlement prison should be and could be. So I would take Stafford or now Ralph Lukowski's at Hull Prison. I would take that as an example of a closed prison. If that was emulated across the prison estate, it would change lives without question. And Spring Hill is an example of an open prison. It is an enabling environment. It's the only men's prison to receive all of the criteria to meet the enabling environment accreditation from the Royal Institute of Psychiatrists. So
Okay,
it's done. They did very well.
Yeah, a good example if people want to look at a prison with good practices.
Absolutely.
Let me move over to the audience. Amy, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask Phil your question? See if that works. Amier, maybe I've pronounced it incorrectly. It was a question around the percentage of the work that you have that focuses on getting people with a criminal conviction into professional services or regulatory positions like law or medicine. Have you had any experience of that, Phil?
That's really challenging. I personally, I work on the ABCD staircase of job progression. So because having a job is such an important step to getting the next job, it works out any job, better job, career job, dream job. So sometimes there's stepping stones along the way. So an example was an IT test manager that I worked with, and he'd caused death by dangerous driving. It was a horrendous accident. Clearly he was reckless. He admitted his mistake, served 5 years in prison, and he came to me with the qualifications as an IT test manager, but having been away from the workplace, he was able to re-enter the workplace as an IT tester. So it's a lower grade. So the employer said, look, I'm getting someone at this level of qualifications, but I'm paying them at this level, and let him build his way up and prove himself. And I think that kind of needs to be that year or two after prison or once back in employment to prove yourself again before you can work back in. In terms of the Financial Conduct Authority and the Solicitors Regulation Authority, I think it's very, very challenging with a criminal record. But at the point at which a conviction is spent, if it can be spent, then I think there are possibilities on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, I have to say, I personally have experience of supporting someone who, in fact, was convicted as a result of the 2011 riots, and she has now successfully followed the qualification route to become a solicitor, and I think that's right. I think it's individually, but we're currently supporting someone who having actually ex-serviceman and who did battlefield medicine, and having done various things when he came out of the army and then subsequently been to prison, but has decided he'd love to go back to that. And he is fighting quite a difficult battle at the moment with the authorities, actually to be able to study at university, to be able to then go and do paramedic training. So it is really hard. And I would actually just, I don't know if there's anyone from Unlock listening, but I do really, really recommend Unlock as a support service for some of those questions. And they are good on some of those professional, access to professional organisations as well. Now, John Samuels, I know you had a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
My question is to both of you as panelists. Do you think that judicial monitoring, meaning that judges and magistrates retain overarching responsibility for those whom they have sentenced, would actually improve the training and employment opportunities of which you have both spoken? I hope you heard that.
Penny, do you want to go first?
Well, I think it's such an interesting idea, and I would love to understand how we think logistically it might work. I think that anything that comes in and looks at what is on offer in terms of the quality and appropriateness of education in prison, and looks at it in the broadest sense, I think would be really helpful. And I think sadly, what one often finds is that there is education that people don't feel leads anywhere for them. And if actually some judicial oversight or involvement in that, or feedback, was able to be structured, then I think, you know, that would be a really interesting idea to look into. I guess it would be a little bit like, there was an example of the drugs court, I think, in West London at one point, where the judge remained very closely involved, and was very successful, because actually he pulled people back to find out what they had done in terms of progression. And so I think it would be a really interesting idea to explore. Phil?
Yes, thank you. I feel very strongly about this, John. I think it's not only the right thing to do, but I think that there's almost a legal obligation, because one of the purposes of sentencing, as you know, one of the statutory purposes of sentencing is reform. So how can a judge know that the sentence is meeting its statutory purpose without monitoring? That's the question I would ask. And, you know, if sentencing just becomes that, you know, that's it and it's done, and they don't hear from the person who's been sentenced, how do they know that reform has happened until and unless that person ends up back in their court? You know, which all that does is it proves the failure to reform. So I feel that judges have a huge amount of influence and such a wealth of knowledge to share as well. I mean, Justice Wilson of the Supreme Court, who kindly supported the book How to Get a Great Job When You've Got a Criminal Record, I first met him because he's patron of the Hardman Trust. He has a real passion and enthusiasm for helping people to turn their lives around. And he attended an award ceremony where people were receiving grants for training, for education, things like for forklift truck licenses and, you know, equipment they might need for their own businesses and those kinds of things. And this enthusiasm that comes from judges and this interest, you know, I think in seeing that justice is done, not just punishment. So personally, I think judicial monitoring should be achieved, and we must start working towards it now. I think Penny raises the point of how could it be done logistically, and that leads us to the wider issues of the deterioration and degradation of our justice system, the reluctance to fund our justice system appropriately. These are kind of the political questions which people have been bashing away at for the last few years, and it has hit crisis point. I don't think anyone who knows about our justice system could argue that this whole system is in complete crisis now. But if we're going to take a long-term view, which I desperately feel our governments need to do, then judicial monitoring should and must form part of the long-term view, because otherwise we will keep sentencing the same people to prison without actually meeting the obligations to reform them.
Thank you, Phil. That's brilliant. I'm just scanning through the questions and trying to see what we have covered or not covered. Tony Fazeli, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I've probably got several actually, but let's just start with it's not something I'm so familiar with, but the judicial updating. And wondered if really from the COVID-19 experience, I live in Leicester, by the way, so I'm still locked down, but wondered if there are things that we could learn that are cost effective and proven doable. I mean, I know a judge who sits in his dining room and, you know, it works. I don't know if he wears his wig or not all the time, but so there are new ways of working that could be cost effective and differently done to open up and make the system better than it is currently, even if obviously careful and strong face-to-face where needed.
Well, I think that the exploration of different types of sentences or different elements to the sentencing, so rather than just saying this is the amount of time you're going to do, you know, a sentence that said this is the amount of time you're going to do, and I would particularly like you to do this course, and I would particularly like you to approach these employers during, you know, or approaches will be made to these employers, or you know, you need to just with a wider scope than just you're going to prison for this period of time, and it's up to the prison officers, offender managers, to decide what they're going to do with you. I don't think that necessarily helps enough. I think if judges were more perhaps informed of the range of interventions that are available and of other opportunities for restorative justice, which is very effective indeed. Gareth Thomas, the rugby player, famously said recently that he was very, very happy with the results of his restorative justice after he was being badly abused. And that was far more effective than a short prison sentence would have been. So I think we, as part of judicial monitoring, we should be looking at alternative sentencing and not just the sentencing for the prison element.
And do you think there are lessons to learn from the remote working, remote communicating, Zoom gatherings that should apply beyond COVID-19 periods?
I think in the point of people being in prison and having video link calls, there are pros and cons. Video link is not as effective as the Zoom call that we're having now. It's very, very difficult with very bad time delays, lags, unreliability at the moment. And it causes a great deal of distress when people are trying to communicate with their solicitors, or they're trying to see what's happening in the court and they can actually only see a tiny part of the courtroom. So there's a lot of ways to improve that. But I think in terms of not having to go on a prison transport bus, which is something I've written about as well, because those cause severe anxiety, vertigo, they're dangerous, there's no seatbelts, disruptive to the family. I asked my wife the other day, I said, what was the worst thing about me being away in prison for you? She said, you being transferred all the time. Because we never knew until the morning, so you don't get told, and I'd be suddenly taken 2 hours away, and she would be, if I was lucky, I'd get to call her in the morning and say, look, I'm on my way somewhere, I don't know where I'm going. But it disrupts all of the network one's built up in the prison, and the family on the outside are like, where is he going to go? I don't know. Is it dangerous? Is it better or worse? So if it helps people not to be transferred and shipped around typically every 6 to 8 months, 2 hours away from home, then I think video link and those kind of communications can be very helpful. But I think they shouldn't be done at the expense of justice, I don't think. Which if the technology is not right, they can be.
Yeah,
thank you.
And that's such a good point, actually. I think I know Penelope Gibbs at Transform Justice has been doing some really interesting work through lockdown about the use of video and Zoom facilities, and actually how you balance both delivering justice but also fair justice, and how, whether people are disadvantaged by being limited to a screen experience. Recommend some of the work that she's done and some of the stuff she's written during this period. We've reached 3:30. I've been given license to potentially have another question. Tom, Tom Schuller, back to the practical question around work, employment and resettlement. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thanks very much, Penny, and thank you, Phil. A really, really impressive talk. I just wanted to ask, given the changing economy and very uncertain employment prospects, can you nevertheless say anything about which particular employment sectors or industrial areas are, in your view, particularly promising for employment of ex-offenders?
I think that's a really interesting question. With COVID-19 and a lot of redundancies and problems, economic problems we're clearly facing, it's going to be a challenging time for recruitment generally. Now, people leaving the country because of Brexit may potentially go some way to mitigating that and freeing up a lot of lower paid jobs, typically minimum wage jobs in a range of sectors. But, we all know hospitality is probably, damaged and devastated, for a couple of years until people start rebuilding. But I find this country are economically very resilient, and people do tend to rebuild after problems like this. I like to advocate for people on an individual basis. So we have a list of 90 employers across a range of sectors, but I prefer to take the very, very individual approach rather than saying there's an employer that employs ex-offenders. I tend to like to look at a person's individual skills, knowledge and experience, and say what company could be the best fit for this person. Because we're still at a stage where 60% of jobs in this country aren't advertised. So they're recruiting from within or from direct contact. So we have no qualms about making direct contact with a company that we think a person may be a good fit with. And then as long as we overcome that objection and are transparent about the disclosure early on, we don't waste anybody's time. Then we find once we get through that hurdle and bridge that gap of explaining the criminal record, then we find there's a good chance of an interview. And we're still finding, 3 interviews is a job offer, even if it's a trial job offer at the moment. So I think it's hard. It probably might be a bit reckless of me.
Approach.
Yeah, personalised approach. Yeah, it might be a bit reckless of me to say I really think that industry is going to thrive and that industry's not. But I think that as long as people, and I say to my applicants, as long as you're flexible in your approach, to be willing to consider that any job, the better job, career job, dream job thing. So whatever job we get for now to start you off, get you a year's experience and track record in a normal job, that is of value. So that tends to be our starting point.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, I think that's so helpful, Phil, and completely reflects where we come from at Standout, which is actually that where you have success is when you recognise that everyone is an individual, and they will have their own strengths, their passions, their experiences, and actually success will come by helping people find what they're really good at and what they're motivated to stay at. I'm not sure if I can see Helen to see if she'd give me a wave for whether there's one more question, but I'll perhaps read it out. Just what you see as, well, the question is, can you say something about mentoring for self-employment as distinct from being an employee? How have you balanced that, Phil, in your approach? Have you kind of dealt with self-employment? Because that's often held out to people as the route to successfully kind of working after prison. I always am concerned that actually setting up your own business is a pretty challenging thing, and that people sometimes come at it because they assume that there are no employers out there who will employ them. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I really have enjoyed working for myself. So I only ever had a couple of jobs, and I spent 20 odd years working for myself in business. So I learned quite a lot about business. And so within the book, I included a chapter on self-employment. But I've also made a point of mentioning the essential requirement to liaise with probation, because if someone is on licence for the 50% less left of their sentence or whatever, they must get any work they're doing or proposing to do, they must get it pre-approved by probation. And probation will take a view as to, is self-employment going to take them down a path of being financially desperate? Is it going to give them instability rather than security and stability? These are the kind of things, and I think a pragmatic approach in most cases says, if you want to be a self-employed plumber, go and work for a plumber first for a year or two, get some knowledge and experience on top of what you've already got, a track record, build that stability around your life first, rather than being desperate to chase the next client or desperate to get the next week's work booked in the diary. Because if things go wrong and you haven't got any money for that week, what's going to happen? Or your van breaks down and you can't pay for the van to be fixed. So there's all these issues that come with self-employment. I'm a great advocate of being independent and self-reliant, but it does also come with an element of feast and famine, a bit of insecurity until it's really up and running. So I have included it in the book, but it's not necessarily a recommendation for most people.
Brilliant, that's so helpful. I feel that, firstly, that we could go on for ages, because this, as I said at the beginning when I introduced you, so much thoughtful reflection from your own experiences that just are fascinating, I think, and so many issues and nuggets that you've touched on, from the impact of a strong and good governor to the reality of short sentences. So this has been a kind of wide-ranging talk, and I feel like if we were in a room, Phil, we would give you a really, really hearty round of applause. And I hope you get a chance to read down some of those comments that just reflect how brilliant it's been to listen to you. You're a natural speaker, and we've been absolutely gripped. And it's been a complete pleasure for me to spend time getting to know you, and I certainly will be following up, because I think there's so much about how you've approached things that we reflect already in how we approach, and I love your wisdom on Standout. So we will look forward to seeing if we can invite you along when we're back operating in prison. But I think your inbox is going to be super full. I think you're going to have lots of approaches. Thank you to Helena. Helena, shall I hand it back to you to round up, just to let people know kind of how they can contact Phil and so on. But thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you, Penny. Could I just say a couple of things? Is that okay? Can I?
Yeah.
Sorry, Helena. So can I? So I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much, Penny. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you as well, and Helena. Thank you, and thank you, Judge John Samuels. You really gave me so much belief when you wrote my preface, and when I was writing to you from prison, and you believed in me and gave me that self-confidence and respect, and it meant the world to me, and I'm very grateful. Thank you. And that's what belief can do. But thanks everyone for attending, and I'll hand you back to Helena. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Phil and Penny. That was really, really interesting, and I think that's reflected in all of the comments and questions that we've had through. If anyone still has questions, Phil has let me know that he's willing for his email address to be shared. So just please get in touch with me, and I'll pass that on. Other than that, yeah, we have another webinar in 2 weeks, which is with Jamie Grundy, and that's on a kind of similar topic, but a slightly different angle on how former prisoners can use their convictions as a unique selling point when trying to access higher and further education and employment when they're out of prison. We also have our half-day conference coming up on the 8th of September. So please save the date. We'll be letting you all know about that in the near future. We're also looking for workshops. So if anyone would like to deliver a workshop or has been to any really good ones and can recommend any, then please do let us know. We'd love to hear those. But otherwise, thank you. I'll be sending around a recording of this to everyone who's attended, so please feel free to share that as well.
Lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again, Phil and Penny as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.